And so this was kind of like advertised as like a dumb teen comedy. But I think it's way closer to a John Hughes movie, meaning like a heartfelt, smart movie.
Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Accolades Conversation Series, in which I talk to some of my favorite artists about who or what they would recommend me checking out. Make sure to subscribe to our channel or hit the like button. Will Hines is an actor and writer who has performed at Ursitti Theater since November 2000. He appeared on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Broad City, Inside Amy Schumer, Conan O'Brien, and many others. I spoke to Will Hines about Teen Wolf, a 1985 American coming-to-age romantic fantasy comedy film directed by Rod Daniel and written by Jeph, Loeb, and Matthew Weisman. Michael J. Fox stars as the title character, a high school student whose ordinary life is changed when he discovers that he is a werewolf. James Hampton, Scott Paulin, Susan Ursitti, Jerry Levine, Matt Adler, and Jay Tarses appear in supporting roles. If you are into my illustrations, this Accolades series started as an illustration book, which you can still get on craterecords.be. This is what Will had to add.
My pick is the movie Teen Wolf, 1985 werewolf movie starring Michael J. Fox. And I like this movie because I think it gets overshadowed in favor of Back to the Future, which came out the same year, also starring Michael J. Fox, which is a much bigger movie in terms of its success and influence. Now, I love Back to the Future. But Teen Wolf is also really good, and it interests me because it was done with a much smaller budget and a much shorter amount of time. The director, Rod Daniel, really liked the script and wanted to make this movie, and I think he made a great film. There's lots of little details of humanity in this film that basically, it's one of these films that's way better than it should be. Way better than you expect it to be. I'm always a fan of things that overachieve beyond their expectations. And I think it's usually the case. I think it's a case where the director, Rod Daniel, just paid a lot of attention and put a lot of work into this film and made it good. And I think his love comes through in the final product. At this time, Michael J. Fox was mostly a television star on this show, Family Ties, but he was a pretty popular one. He was kind of blowing up. And so he was doing his television show and also filming Back to the Future and then also filming Teen Wolf. And Teen Wolf was the last priority. The TV show was where he had become famous. He was very loyal to it. Back to the Future was a huge budget. And then he would go on his few remaining hours and sneak off to Teen Wolf. And I remember he gave an interview at the time and was like, the catering budget on Back to the Future was bigger than the whole budget for Teen Wolf. But I'm a fan of what Teen Wolf was able to do. The basic story is that there's this kid and he finds that he's a werewolf and he's a loser, but by being a werewolf, he becomes popular and it like corrupts his personality and he becomes immoral. And then has to remember who he really is and behave well at the end. And it's basically a moral of what happens to the nerd when he becomes the popular kid. Does he stay nice or does he become a jerk? Well, he becomes a jerk for a little bit and then he gets nice again at the end. The special effects are really just barely good. Like his werewolf makeup, I think it's made fun of a lot because it looks pretty cheesy. But I think it's okay. I think it's all right. I have an affection for sort of cheesy special effects. I think there's something honest about them. So I don't mind that the special effects are a little cheesy. The story does like a really interesting thing, which is this kid becomes a werewolf. It becomes his high school finds out that he's a werewolf. But instead of being scared of him, or instead of scientists descending to examine how this process occurs, he just becomes a popular kid and a star of the basketball team. And that to me is such a funny story decision, that a werewolf doesn't make you a freak of nature. It makes you the most popular guy in school. Is so funny. There's a shot of him as a werewolf wearing sunglasses and a varsity jacket, walking down the halls of his high school, high-fiving people. And I remember in the theater watching that when I was 15 years old and just laughing so much. I was like, what a ridiculous turn of events, and the whole movie makes surprising turns throughout. I think you find out that his dad was a werewolf and sort of kept it secret and just runs a hardware store and has just got a normal life. So I think the script makes surprising choices that you don't expect. And this director only directed like 3 or 4 movies. He did this and another movie called Vice Versa, where Judge Reinhold switches places with his dad. And he did K-9, this Jim Belushi movie. And then he kind of just did TV after that. So he really wasn't much of a movie guy. I think the ones he did are pretty solid. K-9 also, I think, is better than it should be, and vice versa. Oh, it's not vice versa. He did Like Father, Like Son. The director used to direct episodes of a television show called The Newhart, which was an American television show starring the comedian Bob Newhart. And as a director, he liked some of the writers for that show, and so he cast some of the writers from Newhart in the movie Teen Wolf. And so there are these small parts in the movie, and I'm thinking of the high school basketball coach, which is played by a TV writer, not an actor. But the high school coach is such a funny man. He's basically this coach who just like eats bagels while he's playing the game and kind of totally doesn't care that much about winning the game and shrugs his shoulders. And when Michael J. Fox at one point is like, "Hey, I think I'm going to play this game as myself, not as the werewolf," the coach like shrugged his shoulders and says, "Hey, fine with me. We're going to get creamed, but I don't care." And his like, "I don't care" attitude is so funny to me. And I think it's inspired that the director of this movie just hired a writer from another show. It feels like very personal. It feels like the director just hired people he knew that he thought would be good rather than taking the most famous person possible.
Was it advertised as a coming-to-age story, or was it advertised as a comedy?
It was advertised as a comedy. This came out in the mid 80s when there was a lot of like high school hijinks sex comedies like Porky's and Hard Bodies. And there'd be lots of movies where it'd be basically be like a girl in a bikini and like a hapless nerd shrugging his shoulders. Revenge of the Nerds was kind of advertised that way too. And so this was kind of like advertised as like a dumb teen comedy. But I think it's way closer to a John Hughes movie, meaning like a heartfelt, smart movie than a stupid party movie. Sometimes movies would get released with director's commentary, right? This movie was never big enough to get that treatment. So the director on his personal website just published his own director's commentary for Teen Wolf that you could just like download as an MP3 file on your own. It's like the most non-user friendly director's commentary. But I did it. I downloaded that MP3 file and watched it with my Netflix streaming Teen Wolf so I could hear his discussion of the film, and it was really interesting. There's a couple scenes in the movie where they were running late, and so they only had one take to get a whole scene. And so they were just like, okay, this next scene is the only take we have of this scene where Michael J. Fox is talking to his love interest. And it's a master shot of the two of them just walking along the sidewalk. And the director's like, yeah, after we finished that take, the sun set and we couldn't get another one. So that's the only take we have. And to me, that's both a testament of how low the budget was, also maybe how good the actors were that they nailed it in one take, or even if they didn't nail it, they gave you a good enough version. I'm an actor myself, and I'm kind of like, wow, only one take. That's like impressive. It's also impressive to me that he did his own director's commentary and released it like it meant enough to him that he wanted to speak his mind about it. Now, even though it's not as appreciated as Back to the Future, and it's nowhere near as famous as lots of other movies, there is a cult following for Teen Wolf, and lots of the people who saw the original movie are fans of it. It still lives on to a large degree. There was a sequel starring Jason Bateman that was truly terrible, that the director had nothing to do with. There's a MTV did a television show called Teen Wolf, which just borrowed the name. It's got nothing to do with the original movie, but the name kind of lives on. Like, people still have heard of Teen Wolf, and you'll find people who know it. And I'll hear people who will use it in jokes and stuff like that. They'll basically talk about how I'll hear basketball fans describe very good basketball plays as, "Woo, that was Teen Wolf good," referring to how good Michael J. Fox was at basketball when he was a werewolf. So yeah, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of I think this is like, I'm not saying it's the best movie ever, but it's way, way better than it should have been. And I think the people involved, the director, Michael J. Fox, the writers, really cared about it and put a lot of truly good effort into it and
Like
made it good.
I like the idea of like if you look at a plot on paper that it's so dumb, but then
Yes.
like that it's
Yeah,
actually
in the details you make it
yeah
good. Yeah,
yeah yeah
exactly.
yeah.
The basic concept is so stupid. Like the basic pitch of this movie, teenage werewolf becomes basketball star is
Because
that's a stupid movie.
I had a conversation with a rapper that named 3 O'clock High, and that's also one of those movies apparently that is on paper. If you
Yes.
see, it's like a guy that runs into a bully and there's a fight and stuff like that. And what he says like that movie is just brilliant from beginning to end because of like the
Yes.
details in it. So you know,
That sounds exactly the same thing. Like there's lots of movies where they by all right should be the stupidest movie ever, but like
hmm
either by luck or talent, it's actually good. Yeah, it's interesting those movies that we love that not everybody loves. When you do find somebody who loves them, it's kind of like you have found a kindred spirit, somebody who can like see the secret code that you see. I think I just like it when there's evidence of people putting their heart into something. They don't get the money, they don't get the time, so they gotta make up for it with their passion.
hmm
A lot of the things that I love are evidence of that. Um, I'm
and maybe some
like,
and maybe some bad decisions in there as well that like are like
sure, they're never perfect. I mean,
yeah,
the same thing that makes it good also makes part of it bad. I mean, there's definitely parts of Teen Wolf that are bad. There's parts of it that don't land. There's some of it that's silly. Yeah, absolutely.
and
But
does that all have to do with? Do you think that? I mean, you've been in movies and stuff like that. Do you think that has to do
mm,
with budgets because there's like people cut from a certain process that should be there?
money can really help a movie be good, especially if it gives people more time, like more days to shoot, more days to edit, can really improve the quality of something, from what I can tell. But it can also hurt things because if there's a lot of money spent, that means there's a lot of producers watching it and giving notes and trying to make sure their investment comes in. So sometimes a cheap movie has less pressure.
hmm
Sometimes money I think could be a problem. I think the main thing that makes things good is somebody in charge with good taste, whether it's the director or the star, could be a producer, just somebody with power has good taste and can say, this line is too cheesy. Oh, this is too much. These special effects, we got to try to make them a little bit better. Okay, yeah, that's good enough. Like, if somebody's spending $1 billion in a movie, they're not going to do anything risky. They need this thing to hit and they need everybody to watch it. So they got to be very crowd pleasing and very safe. But if somebody's spending $500,000 on a movie, well, they only need it to make 1 million. If it's got a good title and a good poster, maybe that's all they care about. And it lets the director and the writer and the star maybe do some things that are a little different.
You
Yeah, I think like the lower budget ones are where you can see riskier stuff.
There's also something with comedies like I named Anchorman, but like you could say the same thing about like something like Super Bad. You kind of notice that they were taking
Sure.
more risks, and it's like their earlier work, and you,
Well, yeah, that's an interesting case. That's a big budget movie, but what they had Judd Apatow behind them. Like, Judd Apatow directed that, right? That was the first script they ever wrote, and then they sold other things and got them made, and then they brought Superbad back.
okay,
So they'd been working on that for a long time, and but they had I think Judd Apatow's the reason why that's good. Like Judd Apatow was protecting the quality of that movie from he was the guy who had the power and the taste to make sure it was good, to protect it. So I do think it's edgy and it's edgier than things they would all do later. But I credit Judd with having the guts to do some riskier stuff there
hmm
because Judd always has done pretty experimental stuff. I mean, he's also done safe things, but he's done lots of experimental stuff. Comedies like there's a movie from Australia called The Castle that came out in the '90s, very low budget. Heard very few people mention it, and man, I love it. And I'm going to tell you the plot, and it's great. It's a guy who's a poor man who lives in a house by the airport, terrible property, but he loves everything about his life. He thinks it's cool to be near the airport and have planes flying over him all the time. He's near a bunch of power lines. He thinks it's great. There's a nuclear power plant that's ruined the fish near him, and he loves it because it keeps the fish nice and small. and the airport wants to buy his house so they can expand a runway, and he won't sell. He's like, no, this is my dream house. It's my castle. I refuse to sell it. And they're like, are you nuts? Like, this is terrible property. We're offering you good money for it. Most people in your position would be glad to sell. And he refuses. And the movie's about his legal battle to prevent the airport from buying his house. And it's so funny. And it's very low budget. It almost looks like it's filmed on a home movie camera. I've never seen any of the actors in anything else. And it's one of my favorites. So I don't know. Those low budget comedies are where you often find your favorite things, I think.
You already answered my question, because one of my questions would have been, are there other movies like Teen Wolf that you could recommend? So there you go.
Yeah, The Castle's, I mean, the Teen Wolf was pretty successful and had a sequel, and I think people have heard of it. You know, it's not as successful as Back to the Future, but it is successful. But The Castle, in America at least, nobody has heard of it, and I recommend it. There's also a James Gandolfini movie called The Castle that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this Australian comedy.
Because The Castle, the other one that you say, that's like an action movie, right?
Yeah, there's like a action movie that came out in America around the same time. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the Last Castle.
Oh,
is
yeah,
the action movie that came out. I think I'm talking about that. I'm like, nope. There's this movie called The Castle. The movie poster is a middle-aged man in a robe standing in front of his house. That's a rec for me that very few people have seen.
I want to thank Will for this conversation. On next week's episodes, I'm talking to Bobby Simmons of the legendary Stetsasonic about the even more legendary Bomb Squad. Thanks for listening, watching, or however you check out Accolades. I appreciate the thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the program. See you next week.